bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Society and the State for episode number 50. Pretty fun that we've come to this milestone. Connor Boyack here, along with Brian Hyde, to talk about the racist roots of many modern laws that we have today. Things that are taken for granted as the status quo that seem just normal, but when you peel back the layers of modernity that have been encumbered upon the top of these historical laws that have been around for a while, you find that the foundations of them are rotten to the core. And so in talking with Brian, we came up with a few that we wanted to talk about today. Maybe I'll get things rolling, Brian. We want to talk about marriage licensure, the prohibition on marijuana or cannabis, immigration law, and zoning as well. So maybe I'll start us off with talking about marriage law. And frankly, I'm surprised. I wrote a blog post about this several years back, and I was amazed how few people were aware of this. I thought it was more commonly understood that the foundations of marriage licensure were based in the desire to kind of keep the race pure, to deny interracial marriage. And so even back into the 1600s, and especially through the foundation of the federal government and onward, you had many colonies and then states here in America enacting restrictions on marriage based on race. And so, for example, Maryland in 1664 got the ball rolling. In Virginia, they banned interracial marriage in 1691. Now, marriage licensure came on a little bit later where those laws were in place, but then they used licensure as a vehicle where, well, if you had like a lenient, judge or whatever, you might be able to still get it done if you got that permission slip. But in several locations, it was much more difficult to obtain the licensure because of the underlying laws that were prohibiting this. And so, for example, in Virginia, even through the 1900s, there were people who were very strongly enforcing the laws in that state that did allow at the time white people to marry a person of another race, provided that the non-Caucasian genetic makeup comprised less than 1/16 of the individual's genome. Right, so you'd have to
that sounds burdensome.
Yeah, here's my family history. I can prove that.
Wow.
And so you had folks that were very strongly enforcing this. North Carolina in 1715, they prohibited illegal and unlawful marriages and required that the betrothed couple seek a government license in order to sanction their union. They followed it up in 1749 that. With a law that sought to, quote, prevent clandestine and unlawful marriages and prohibited interracial marriages as well. And so all throughout the 19th and 20th century, you see licensure being used as a way to deny consenting adults the ability to do what they want. It was not based on any legitimate public health need or public safety or, these kind of core government purposes. This was very much an effort by the government to interfere with racial relations. Interestingly, many people heard of this just a few years ago when there was an interracial couple in Louisiana. I mean, this is recent. In Louisiana, there was this interracial couple that was trying to get married. Let's see, this was in 2011, I believe, and the judge denied them permission to marry. And he was quoted in the press as saying, "I'm not a racist. I just don't believe in mixing the races that way." And so,
dang,
take that for what it is. But the requirement in our day that you have to go to the government, seek permission, prove yourselves, pay a fee, get a permission slip, has its roots. All of marriage licensure has its roots in the desire of government to deny certain people. And they can't, they can deny by just prohibiting certain things. Like, I prohibit you from growing your weeds past 8 inches. They're not going to start, don't put it past them, but we don't have licensure for landscaping in order to grow things.
Yet,
exactly. Don't put it past them. But that's kind of the idea here, is that it's one thing to just prohibit things and say no interracial couples may marry, but it's another thing to very proactively enforce that by creating this regulatory bottleneck through which everyone must go, that when you sit husband and wife together there in the courtroom or the the clerk's office, and they can see and verify, okay, we got 2 white people here, that's okay, right? Or 2 black people. It's the government's desire to prohibit that leads it to license.
There's an aspect of this, too, that I think sometimes is easy to overlook. Obviously, for people who are just simply trying to maintain racial purity, that is one approach, but there's another side effect that comes in here. And think about this. When a couple marries, rights of inheritance come into play for themselves, for their children. So if one spouse were to die, who would inherit the other's estate? And likewise, their children. Back in the day when the Huguenots and the Catholics were fighting it out in France, Huguenot marriages were not recognized because they weren't licensed. And the idea behind that wasn't so much even to keep the races pure as it was to make sure that no one who was a Protestant could inherit property. See how that works? You can deprive people of their property rights if you can delegitimize their marriage. So it reaches to a lot of angles besides just the racist part of it.
That's super interesting, right? Because and often I find that these racist elements are cloaked in other excuses or arguments, right? Because
public safety.
Yeah, exactly. Like even a century or 2 ago, things were much more explicitly racist, but even then they would come up with these justifications. It's not just because you're black, it's because black people are more likely to commit crime, right? And so maybe let's take that into the next one, which is marijuana. This is absolutely racist. When you look at how marijuana or cannabis was criminalized in America, placed on a Schedule I, which says that there's no generally accepted medical uses at all. When you look at the federal government's strong and sudden shift, because back in the day, cannabis was in many medicines. Many. I mean, it was kind of a key ingredient in many of the medical concoctions that were being spread around for all sorts of ailments. And so it was widely used. So much so that when the federal government started to ban marijuana, a lot of the public had no clue that this was the cannabis that was in their, medicine cabinet. And so there are 2 key things that come in here into play when we're talking about cannabis, and that is, why is it even called marijuana, right? So in Mexico and some of the Central American and perhaps South American countries, but primarily Mexico, this plant, cannabis, was referred to as marijuana with actually an H. We write it in English with a J, but it's marijuana. And it was that term that was used to in the American public sphere to tie this plant to this racist element of these Mexicans that were coming into America, stealing jobs, raping white women. And so by tying the plant to these people who were seen as inferior and problematic was a great way to build public support for opposing this plant and supporting regulation and prohibition. So you had 2 key people. One is William Randolph Hearst, who owned, a ton of newspapers and paper production and everything. And he saw hemp as an economic competitor, right? Because hemp can be produced in amazing ways, and compared to especially other textiles and even paper, it's a big competitor. And so he didn't want hemp to take off. And so he started using his newspapers to whip up this racist-based fervor against marijuana that had little to no basis in fact at all, but it got people whipped up, this reefer madness idea, and people are going to be crazy in the streets and seducing your women and, plundering your property and so forth. And so that was able to get the press and the public whipped up because William Randolph Hearst saw hemp or cannabis as competition. The other one was Harry Anslinger. So Harry Anslinger ran the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which is kind of the precursor to today's Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. And it was actually housed under the Treasury Department. But this was right as Prohibition was ending. And so here you have a guy, Harry Anslinger. I've actually been reading kind of a quasi-biography of him a little bit more recently. It's very fascinating. This guy, he wasn't super competent. He was this bureaucrat, and he had this budget and this staff that all of a sudden was being made irrelevant because Prohibition was going away. And he wanted to, in an effort of self-preservation, find a new drug that he could go after. And he had never really considered cannabis. He just thought it was like no big deal. So he was thinking of like going after cocaine or heroin or things like this. But he found an opportunity in demonizing cannabis as marijuana that allowed him to significantly expand. Because if you think about it, very few people use today heroin or cocaine or things like this. But the use of cannabis was very prevalent. And if he wants to grow his staff and grow his budget, he needs something that is rampant rather than something that is rare. And so he sent this letter out to, I think, 26, 27 doctors asking for their scientific opinion about cannabis, its addictive nature, its destructive nature, things like this. And every one of them replied and said, no, this is great. It helps people, et cetera, except for one physician who expressed some concerns about,
the demon weed.
Its danger, the loco weed, exactly. And so Anslinger latched onto and elevated this one physician, even though he was a substantial minority compared to the other physicians who he just ignored. And so I'm going to read a couple quotes from him just to give you an idea of the racist roots of cannabis prohibition. So he says, reefer, or marijuana, or cannabis, he says, reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. Another one, he says, there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana usage. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. I mean,
boy, no fear-mongering at work there.
Not at all. Okay, final one. This is a short one. He says, the primary reason to outlaw marijuana is, he continues, its effect on the degenerate races. So
Margaret Sanger would blush to hear that kind of language.
Founder of Planned Parenthood, who herself was an extreme racist, right? And so this is astounding when you realize that kind of the two guys who shaped public opinion, who shaped public policy, who demonized an entire plant that few at the time realized was the cannabis that was in their medical potions and so forth back then. This is all racist. And so I think, again, in our day, the justifications for keeping it illegal have been encumbered with all these other excuses. And those excuses have been falling apart, which I think is a strong reason why many states, especially other countries that don't have this racist history, have legalized the use of cannabis, especially for medicinal purposes, and in some cases, so-called recreational purposes as well. When you realize that the foundation of this entire structure is rotten to the core, it's only time, I think, before it crumbles to the ground.
I think there are a lot of people who, through no fault of their own, lack historical perspective and would be shocked to realize just a little over 100 years ago, up until about roughly 1914, you could walk into pretty much any drugstore and get cannabis.
Yep.
You could get cocaine. You could get heroin. And I'm not talking with a prescription. You didn't have to have doctor's orders. You could get a tincture of opium, laudanum. You could get those things without restriction. And I'm not trying to play it up and say, and it was great and nobody ever got hooked. People did get addicted to actual narcotics, habit-forming drugs. But it was rare. And they served as a cautionary tale for people the same way that, people, lived their lives in a bottle if they became alcoholics.
And it was rare in part because the potency was lower. When you think about what prohibition does, both for the so-called prohibition we think of with alcohol, but drug prohibition more generally, think of the Al Capones during prohibition, the risk that was involved in transporting their ill-gotten or ill-produced, product. They had significant risk of getting caught. They weren't going to transport low-quality, low-cost
3.2 beer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To justify the risk, they had to increase the potency to increase the cost so that the value was sufficient for them to incur that risk and go about the city. And so you have, during the Prohibition era, you see a rise in the potency of liquor, of the greater alcohol content rising, where after that, all of a sudden, it's much more common. And then the dangers that come along that with driving under the influence. I mean, if someone tosses a beer back, they're, maybe a little buzzed, they're stupid to go out on the road. But, if they are pounding half a bottle of Jack Daniels and then get in the car, that's something quite different. And so the potency changes. I think it's the same thing with cannabis and a lot of these other drugs. when you prohibit something, then that leads people to increase the potency, to increase the value, to justify the risk. Whereas, as you point out, back in the day, there were all these medications that had, drugs in them, but the potencies were a lot lower. And yeah, like there were probably side effects and addictions and so forth. But even then, my thought is better to deal with that as a public health problem. Oh, you're addicted. Let's wean you off of this. Let's get you something else. Let's help you, rather than the full force and weight of the criminal justice system and the Harry Anslingers of the world banging down your door and throwing you in jail. I mean, if we're talking about public health crisis, killing people or this stuff is a little bit worse than them sitting in their living room addicted.
As you pointed out earlier, too, the reason, for instance, that you could buy, let's just say cough syrup. Maybe some people have seen the old cough syrup bottle that has morphine in it. It has cannabis in it. And it has, a host of other things. And, it looks like pretty potent stuff. But the reason that these things were available wasn't just because people were, trying to get their kicks and live their life as druggies. There was a recognized medical benefit for those remedies. And, and people were trusted to make those decisions, presumably, with the help of their physician. But, Henry Anslinger. Have you seen the movie Reefer Madness? Have you ever watched it?
Oh, yeah. Good times. I
would recommend, if you haven't seen it, it's worth watching, if only to get a glimpse into what propaganda and hysterical kind of thinking looks like.
It was produced in 1936, and you can find it on YouTube. So if you've not watched it, they even made not quite a sequel, but they made another one that was like it, not anywhere near as popular. I can't remember the name, but yeah, it's almost comical to watch, right? How overt and silly it is. But it gets to these like racist elements at the root of all of this, that the fear mongering and the racism that they put in there. All right, so for time, let's move to the next one. Let's talk about zoning really quick and then end on immigration. When you see in the early 1900s is really when zoning starts to take off, when a lot of city administrators and mayors and municipal officials realize that there's this proactive way to shape a city regulatorily rather than this laissez-faire, move where you want, do what you want. And so, I think of, for example, in 1910, the mayor of Baltimore, this was Barry Mahul, and he says, blacks should be quarantined in isolated slums in order to reduce the incidence of civil disturbance. So here's the justification. It's not because they're black. It's that black people cause civil disturbance. And also, he continues, to prevent the spread of communicable disease into the nearby white neighborhoods and to protect property values among the white majority.
What office did he hold again?
He was mayor.
Wow.
Mayor of Baltimore, 1910. He signed into law a racial zoning ordinance. And this was nothing isolated. There were, especially in southern places, but San Francisco, California cities as well, for reasons we'll talk about when we get into immigration in just a moment. Richmond in 1911, there was a zoning ordinance that made it illegal to sell a house on a majority white block to a black person, or a house on a majority black block to a white person. And so if you think about the permission slip, going back to marriage, the requiring people's actions to have the permission of the government before they do it, zoning is the classic example. You are not allowed to buy this house. You're not allowed to live here unless we say so. And to get your permission slip, you have to have the right race. We don't want black people coming here. We want this central planning where we're going to organize everything and orchestrate it all. And so, again, much like marriage licensure trying to centrally plan society and posterity, right? Who's going to have sexual relations and children with whom? You see the same thing in terms of where people live, the communities that are created, that this central planning state apparatus was very much using racism as well.
It's curious how freedom of association, which is an extension of your property rights, also plays into this. You cannot associate with this person if you want him or her to be your spouse. You cannot live in a neighborhood with these people, even though they may be your friends if you're not the right color. And people may wonder, well, why does that freedom of association matter? And put it simply, look, either you choose those with whom you will associate or somebody else does.
It's so interesting to me, too, though, that a lot of this is not necessarily only historical, much like marriage licensure and the Louisiana judge just a few years ago, right? You look at the same thing with this issue of zoning. And there have been studies just in the past decade, several studies looking at the relationship between high density and low density type policies and racial segregation, looking at the communities that have high levels of racial segregation still, and then contrasting or correlating that to the city's zoning policies where they have very stringent, high density and the low density for the rich white people with bigger estates and so forth can, have easier access. And it's really interesting that a lot of this, even though it's like this historical foundation, still has tentacles that reach as far into our day as well.
I wonder if that was a consequence that those who enacted those ordinances ever considered. Here's one of the bottom lines as far as it pertains to zoning. When people are free to choose to voluntarily associate with those with whom they would choose to associate, they get along. And it doesn't matter. Color is not that big of an issue. That's why you will find neighborhoods that have, this remarkable mix of people of different colors, races, ethnicities, economic backgrounds. But when you force people into association or you deny them the ability to associate, that's when you see resentment begin to build. And that's when you actually can find yourself literally in the wrong part of town.
I'm reading right now looking at an article from Reason that was written a few years ago. We'll link to this as well as some articles on the other issues that we're talking about today on societyandthestate.com/50. And this article mentions a Washington Post article that had recently been written that talked about longtime residents of certain neighborhoods in Fairfax County that had begun calling or emailing the county's code enforcement division with complaints about, too many cars in driveways, too many people in certain houses. And then when looking at the data, apparently the objects of the recipients of those complaints were always immigrants. So large Asian families, Hispanic families. And so they make the point here in the article that the rise of urban planning, central planning through zoning allows, and this is their quote, it allows discrimination, but dresses it up as discriminating taste. And so that's really interesting that even in our day, like people are, the other, oh, that person's black and we're all white. Like, I mean, I live in a neighborhood that's like 98% white. I'm in one of the most conservative white places in Utah. And so there's very little of that. I can see how in neighborhoods like that, some people might want to maintain that just because that's all they know. And, disturbing that for some people, especially maybe older folks who have kind of that, baggage of a different era and culture, would use the power of government to continue to enforce and maintain that status quo.
Let's touch on immigration.
All right. So this is an issue that 100% is born in racism. And it really gets its start after the gold rush in California when a massive amount of Chinese people in the mid-1800s see an opportunity to try their hand at mining for riches and other industries as well. But after the big fever pitch of the gold rush passes, many of the Chinese remained, and a lot of them became employed on the Transcontinental Railroad project, which was a huge thing at that time. And they began to compete with American workers for day laborer jobs. And so this, of course, didn't sit well for people who felt entitled to, American jobs. The Chinese as a bloc, as a group, became perceived widely as an economic threat. And so San Francisco at this time, right, it's this big multicultural melting pot. There was a protest in 1870 by factory workers rallying around the slogan, "The Chinese must go." And this bled into popular culture. There were cartoons and books and all sorts of stuff that employed this widespread attack on Chinese immigrants, painting them as strange, rat eaters and job stealers. And so what you see is that the culture turned into policy, which is not unsurprising at all. And so starting at the municipal level and later at the state level, you had laws that were specifically targeted to Chinese people. For example, San Francisco passed an ordinance that forbade people from walking on sidewalks with a pole and basket over their shoulders, which was a method that was often used by the Chinese.
Sure.
Right? Western states started to pressure the federal government to institute restrictions on immigration. And even though there was this, it was called the Burlingame Treaty, it was signed 22 years before with China, recognizing the right of migration, the inalienable right of people to choose their allegiance and where they want to live and so forth. In fact, I want to read it real quick because this was a good treaty. So before all this racism really took off, It said, this treaty with China said, the United States of America and the Emperor of China cordially recognize the inherent and inalienable right of man to change his home and allegiance, and also the mutual advantage of the free migration and emigration of their citizens and subjects, respectively, from the one country to the other for purposes of curiosity, of trade, or as permanent residence. So saying, hey, look, we have a right to live where we want. We recognize that free migration, emigration is a wonderful thing that, benefits. And so that substantially changed in the 1880 amendment that suspended Chinese immigration. They grandfathered some people in, but they started to really crack down on the Chinese government, on Chinese immigration, and then things just bled outwards. They started including other races. They started adding time thresholds, but it was all based on this racist element. We see the same thing, like I'm from San Diego, and growing up, we would have, Mexican or Central American workers all the time, and you see the opposition to people because of their race. Now, it was often tied in, we just need, they need to come in through the front door. I'm nothing against Mexican people, but I saw plenty of examples of people who definitely objected to them because of, race, because of their culture, even though they tried to sometimes, not all the time, but they, mask it in other arguments that they thought would be more palatable. But at the end of the day, it was this, economic threat that people were reacting to.
I have to say it's refreshing to have a discussion of racism that doesn't sound like a bunch of social justice warriors chanting on a college campus. And I think the word racism is sometimes overused, but I also think you've done a very good job of providing, some great evidence that things that we see happening around us, policies in place today, have their roots in some pretty twisted thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's the concern in our day. Like a lot of people just look at the present or perhaps look to the future, but I think it's so important in our public policy to look towards its foundation, look towards its roots, because I think we need to have an honest and healthy conversation with ourselves and say, wait a minute, like to what extent are these modern policies still rooted in either racism specifically or more broadly the desire to control social outcomes and say, well, no, we want the wealthy to be here and we want the well-educated over here, or, like Planned Parenthood, right? We want to get in a little bit of eugenics and we don't want, as many black babies being born. Like, okay, well, let's talk about that. Are we completely disconnected from that and we've, we're new people and we've moved on and we're better? Or do we still have something like that? And I think looking at the like flag protests and some of the stuff with the NFL, I think there's plenty of incidents in our day where a lot of this stuff still creeps in. All right, guys, we'll cut it there. Until next time, we are Society and the State. Join us on the next episode. It'll be number 51. We got a fun guest for you, but we appreciate you subscribing. Be sure and share the link with your friends. We'd love to reach more people. We're thankful you're with us. And until next time, we'll see you then.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.